Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Symbolism Happens Spotlight, the show where we spotlight a member of the Symbolic World community. They get to share their story and some interesting ideas they've been thinking about. So today we have Mike. How are you doing, Mike?
Hey, I'm doing pretty good. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Pleasure having you here. So let's just get straight into it. First couple questions, just to get to know maybe a little bit more about you. Can you tell us a bit about your just religious background and your journey, before you discovering symbolism?
Yep. So I was when I was growing up, I was raised a Catholic, but it did not have I for some reason, it didn't have a connection to me in a deep kind of way. And I kind of gradually moved away from the church. And then when I got to college, I had some experiences which sort of um, turned my world upside down, and I had to kind of rethink the way that I was looking at the world. And when I did that, I realized the that the church was actually the place where everything kind of was going down, basically. And I didn't realize that actually at first. I started listening to Jordan Peterson, and then through him I found Jonathan Pageau, and in the symbolic world, in the contemplation of symbolism, and and in the um, and in the Orthodox Church. um, I found what I was looking for. So yeah, so that's my journey into symbolism, and I suppose kind of back to the church.
All right. If you don't mind, can you describe some of the maybe experiences you had that led to that sort of breaking point, or if not the experiences specifically, just sort of like reflections, feelings, thoughts that were going through your head during that time?
Okay, yeah. Um, so one thing for sure that I found out is that I what I realized that the patterns that are kind of make up um, our lives, like patterns like the life and death, things like that. If you look at uh, structures like cells, like biology, in these different things, and you uh, do that through the lens of these basic patterns, then you get a tremendous amount of power over uh, the world. You can do things. Basically, you can invent tons of different kinds of technology. All this type of different stuff. And But the thing about it is that the kind of gate, into that intuition from which you'd be able to get all this technology is sort of a two-way door. So you get things, but then things also get
Hmm.
and it opens the door to actual meaning. You can't be a nihilist anymore once you start realizing that. So so eventually I was like, oh dang, there's this thing that I've realized is also, it also has real meaning to it. It's not a fake thing. And um and that kind of undid me, because yeah, I was more of a materialist, and I didn't really believe in those kind of things. So I had to figure out what on earth the encounter was, what I was even encountering. And a lot for a while I didn't want to admit that it was something really meaningful. But eventually I just basically had to, and a little bit at a time. um, and you know and I think I've and it found a place for that most important thing, you know. So that was the experience I had though. You know, uh, there's yeah, that was a big part of the experience I had. So I would say a lot of it is like a lot of it's just uh is coming to the end of something, and then it's like, yeah, it's, you know, it's coming to the end of something, and then and you don't totally know it, like you don't know, you know, like I didn't know for years um that I was gonna eventually like have an experience that would um change me, and I didn't even know that I was having that experience when I was having that experience. You know, uh but you know, it it's there's, you know, Christ is real basically. And so it's like, you know, so yeah, I don't know. That was a very disjointed description there, you
No, I
know.
think
You know,
it's
so yeah, it's hard to talk about because it's hard to talk about because it's hard to kind of talk about the experience. I'd have to tell you something that would kind of get you to have that experience. And I don't know, I don't have a good, I don't think I have a, I don't know a good way of doing that. So it's like, I think it just has to sound disjointed. Like I think if we got to know each other better, I think like, you know, I'd be able to say something which would like, you know, which would have an effect. That's why it's hard to talk about. It's like,
mm.
because like, you know, so
Yeah, no, I understand. Like trying to make sort of that felt experience explicit. It's a bit tricky, but thank you for trying. But I think what I got from it was sort of like a re-entering of like meaning, sense, and just, or maybe even like a discovery of meaning in things that you didn't previously maybe think had
yeah,
any meaning or
yeah,
just
for
thought
sure,
were purely materialistic. And I know
yeah.
offline we talked a bit about like rituals and, you know, growing up in the Catholic Church, seeing all these rituals. Like, how would you say that your perspective of these rituals changed or, you know, upgraded as you know, got into symbolism and started maybe unpacking what they meant?
Yeah. One thing I noticed was that um, the rituals change the way that your perception of the world. Like okay, like a whole lot of the yeah, a whole lot of, you know, symbolic thinking is realizing just how much your perspective is having an effect on the world around you. And rituals are the structure of your perception. So it's like, you know, if you realize if you realize that uh your the way that you interact with the world has a is creating the world basically, then you'll realize that the rituals that you're structuring your perception with are going to create the world in a certain way too. And you know, a lot of it's unconscious, I think so anyway.
Mm.
But it's like, but you know, it comes it but I mean, I'm and a lot of it too, like I've been thinking, like for yeah for yeah, I would say that it's a lot of it's unconscious. It's just structuring the way that you perceive the world, uh which structures the world itself. So um
Yeah, I think the way I've been able to sort of like just experience it in small glimpses is as you participate in the rituals, sometimes as you're just walking about doing regular life, certain things will just appear to have a clearer connection to, I guess, God or to just you know, the meaning that they contain. So thank you for sharing, going through that experience. Must have been hard to, you know, hard to unpack, hard to make explicit. But just maybe some more explicit ideas. Uh, what, you know, other ideas from the symbolic world generally have you found, you know, useful or beneficial to your life? Like, what are the ideas you gravitate towards that you happen to think about more, or just that have an impact on you?
mm. So that it's one thing that's interesting to me is that in the symbolic world, it's like there's it seems like there's a um it seems like there's like a sensible way where story and the like something like the real world or like the scientific world or something like that come together, which is definitely like uh like I think that's what everyone wants. Like it's like it feels like it feels like that's what it's like if you it's like because we have these two kind of extremes. We have like there's like uh people sort everything into like fiction or nonfiction, and it's like you know those two categories shouldn't be separate. It's also like art and uh you know science or something like that. It's like then there's the art, which is just this completely you know unrecognizable mess basically, and then there's the science, which is just a bunch of drudgery, and they don't even talk, they never talk to each other, but you can only have one or the other. And I think in the symbolic world, it's nice that it's like the only place I've found basically there where there's like hints of them coming together. Um, you know, uh, uh, and it's the seriousness with which people take uh, the symbols in the Bible, which is makes them like capable of supporting things that are extremely uh, meaningful to people, and that allows people to then start like living in the world where um you know the symbolism happens basically. So that is uh you know something that I don't see anywhere else either. um uh you
I
know
don't know. Do you like go to school? Do you study something in particular right now, like in
Right
terms of
now,
academics?
not, just a little bit of some philosophy, art, that kind of thing. But I don't think I'm studying. I was mostly studying business, so I don't think that's
Mm. Have you
Um,
been able to make any interesting connections between business and symbolic thinking?
yeah. Well, for sure. I mean, for sure, Jonathan Pageau's the video he did about NFTs. I mean that's the way. So like uh, okay. So as the government prints more money, this is in the like I guess monetary side of economics. Um, so as the government prints dollars and lends them out to different countries, then what happens is that the mechanism, because the price mechanism is not just uh, how much stuff people actually have, but because there's no such thing separate from the way that people, as in the people in the market, are understanding how much stuff they have,
Hmm.
and the price mechanism is related to how people in the market understand how much they have. And so when the government prints money, it affects. It's like the price mechanism is like the eyeball of the market. It's like the eye. So the when the government prints money, it affects it affects the way that you like the way that wealth like the way that yeah the way that wealth is perceived. So when that happens, then uh of course when the government does it, like they do it in order to try and make people perceive more wealth. But then like eventually what happens is that there's a like a crackdown where all of the stuff that is not accounted for in the price mechanism, because normally the price mechanism is like an eye, like it's a person, but the person is the way that the price mechanism would be able to see areas where there was a shortage of some type of part or some type of material or something like that, and then it would be able to account for that in the price. But when the price mechanism is distracted basically, then then it can't see all of those little shifts that are happening from the underlying, foundations, right? Obviously, the foundations are kind of always moving down there. Nature is moving. There's different resources, different climates. And so instead of healthily integrating those changes in the form of um, adjusting prices that are accounting for that, the changing of the price mechanism causes there to be a buildup of these little changes underneath. And then eventually that swamps the markets. And that's what the crash is. So the government over the years, the pricing mechanism is related to the value of money. And so as the value of money has been uh, degraded, then the pricing mechanism has entered these more and more extreme cycles of boom and bust. So it will, so as as the government will affect the price mechanism more to try and affect people's perceptions of wealth, that will in turn cause there to eventually be an even bigger overturning of the whole market when those underlying forces underneath overturn the stable price structure, the stable economy that's been set up. And like a way you can see this so you'll have a normal situation where there's a certain amount of money that can get loaned out to start a new business. And normally the banker is in charge of this money, and they'll use discernment because there's a limited amount of money. And so they'll say, well, okay, this person wants to start a business. They've got, a reliable history. They've got sources of capital, and they've got assets that can be collateral, versus this person has no collateral, no experience, and no assets. So they're going to make the loan to the first person, obviously. But in the situation where there's more money, now two loans can get made, to the person who has the collateral and stuff, and then to the person who doesn't. And so now there's a situation where a business has been created. People are now starting to work at that business, but the business doesn't do anything productive. It doesn't do anything. And so eventually that has to get accounted for. So eventually it can't pay back the loan, or, something like that. Or what happens is they keep trying to print money to give them more time to pay off the loan, but then you get inflation. Something happens. And then then things will start to turn. And so then these businesses that have been created, because they were created, through a lack of discernment, then eventually they fall apart. It's like there's basically some of these investors have great quotes. Like I think a lot of them have really good insight, but they don't know it. But it's like Warren Buffett has a quote where he says, when the tide goes out, you get to see everyone who's been swimming naked, basically. So it's like a lot of these businesses, like they're not covered by like good discernment, good judgment. They're just swimming naked, and then when the money tide goes out, then they just get overturned by the, by the everything going on underneath. So
Yeah,
those are
from your explanation, like I kind of get flood story vibes from the business world.
yes, yes,
Like
yes.
I don't know if you've ever like applied it directly, but the way you're describing the perception and then the sort of disconnect between what is real and what people are doing, the world that is real and the world that the banks and the monetary system is acting on. Um, that disconnect, and then eventually you have like this flood, this crash, and only those who I guess are not swimming naked will end up surviving the flood, and then it
Yeah.
starts over again.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, and the thing is that for the past few cycles of that's been happening. So like in the 1990s, they did the first they've been messing with the money supply for a while, but in the 1980s they allowed the price mechanism to fix itself so that it was correctly uniting, we could say, heaven and earth, right? Correctly giving people information and connecting them to what was really going on underneath. And it was reset. And then after the inflation that happened in the 70s, and then in the 90s, they started inflating the money supply again. and then they got the dot-com crash. But they didn't let the pricing mechanism fix itself. They just printed more money to get out of that, quote unquote, right? Because it does to a little bit, but it's not. So they printed more money, and then that was the 2000, the lowering of interest rates that happened in the 2000s, in the era of the 2000s. That led to the housing crash. Now, did they let the pricing mechanism reset itself? No, they did not. So we had even more money printing. That was quantitative easing. There was several cycles of that, and that was what happened in the last decade that we just had. And then we've had another crash in COVID, but they've basically, I mean, at this point right now, they're saying we're going to raise interest rates, and that's what's going to fix the pricing mechanism. Because when you raise interest rates, that gets rid of all of the businesses that are only surviving on credit and not surviving because they're correctly able to deal with the facts, but if the thing is that there's been so much liquidity that basically all businesses, basically all of them pretty much, are not legitimate at this point. So it's like I personally don't believe that they're going to make it. They're going to put everyone out of work and basically bankrupt the government. Like, I just think it'll be politically untenable. So I think they're going to just go back to printing money, and they're just going to print it. And this time, though, there's just going to be massive inflation. So I think actually I have a lot of money invested in gold mining stocks, because I think that because so people think like the West is so strong. They're like, oh, NATO and all these people. I'm like, we have trillions of dollars of trade deficits that we get from China every year. It's like, all of that is goods, because all of that is vendor finance. Basically, they're giving it to us on credit, and we have never paid them back, and they've been doing that for like 20 years. It's like, we have no productive capacity whatsoever. Like, we're so weak. It's like, all it will take will be when the dollar stops being the world's reserve currency, and then we're basically toast. So, I mean, maybe there's cultural ties and stuff, but economically, we're in a very bad situation. So,
interesting symbolic analysis of the current economic situation of the West. It's changing onto like a more another one of your interests. You talked to me offline a little bit about how you're interested in like narrative stories, especially the more crazy stories. Could you sort of tell me a bit, what do you think the importance of narrative is in the way we perceive and structure the world, right? Like,
okay, yeah.
I think you said something along the lines of like narrative being the, I don't know, you phrased it in a very peculiar way offline. You said narrative sort of as being like the reason for which things exist, something like that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So, like, all right. So let's just start like at the very basic level. So, like, when to have anything that exists, any object, you need it to have a reason, because the object itself, there's an infinite number of ways you could look at it. You could look at it from like, because if you look at like a lighter, let's say, from the bottom, it looks different from the top. So those are two different things you're seeing, two different sets of, visual stimuli. So the reason why you think those two things are the same is because of the reason of using the lighter to light incense, candles, whatever it is. And so that reason comes from narrative. It basically comes from, well, first it comes from people. It comes from I think it comes from the people around you. But I think the source of where the people around you get the reason for things that they impart to you is the center, like, of all of that is basically narrative. I think it's like, or if you describe that center where it all comes from, it's a narrative description, because it's just like, that's just the only way you can describe it, basically. That's the only way you can describe it, because it's so meaningful, it's so so uh, so important. And so um, and so so that's how so
So I'm
yeah,
guessing
so
like
that's how.
this, you say like this is kind of links to this idea of like teleology, where the the way you perceive things and their identities is in their use, their function, their purpose, like the goal they tend towards. Um, so you would just apply that more broadly to narrative in general as this sort of like fulcrum, this axis around which then things spring forth,
Yeah,
outwards.
yeah, because if you think about it, like narrative is like if you think about the difference between a narrative and like a scientific description of something that you would get in a like a an engineer magazine for something, like a car or something. It's like the narrative is so much closer to the way that you um experience an object when you like first realize like what the use of it is. It's like you know so that's and that's where the yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, so yeah, just linger on that point a bit. Do you think that so when engineers sort of take a product, um, how do you think they think about narratives? Right? Do you think they step out of the narrative to look at the product in sort of like some objective way, or do you think that even the engineers in their tinkering with the little individual pieces, do you think they still keep a vision, or that vision is necessary to still make good, interesting engineering?
Yeah, I no, I think it has to be.
Mm,
Because because it's like the it's like for an engineer to really put together a computer, you know, they have to like you have to think about just how much work goes into making a computer. It's like there's just so many steps. Like it's just so many steps. And there are people like cuz I work in construction right now. And there's people who like in I'm going to use an analogy to this construction, but it's like there's people who can see the entire process of like the house, all of it, and it's like there's so many steps, um the only really way that you can keep all of that straight is if you have some kind of reason holding it all together, some type of thing that's not it's not nothing. It has to be something meaningful. Otherwise, there's just no way you could figure out how to put all of the all of the pieces together. There's just too many.
mm. Yeah, and I guess in that in that same way, the way you would organize right like a society, or the way a society would organize itself, or like a culture towards like a sustainable moving direction, is also
Yeah.
through those cultural narratives, through its mythology. So like, what do you see right now as sort of the big cultural drivers, the big stories that are sort of like, let's say, pushing the Western world, good or bad?
Yeah, I think yeah. So we talked about this in the pre-meeting, but definitely the story of Atlantis, like I've noticed, is a narrative that's being played out right now. Um, um, uh, so in the sense that we have this belief that if we can get the metaverse basically up and running, then that's going to be the solution to all our problems. But the reason why we think it's the solution to all our problems basically is that we are the narrative that we're living out is this narrative where it's just like we just act on impulse. Basically, it's like acting, fulfilling desire in a very immediate way. And so it's like, so you're in the metaverse and you think I want to be in the metaverse because if I was in the metaverse, then I could just instantly, you know, I could just instantly build, build a mausoleum, like a beautiful, you know, carved mausoleum. But the problem with that is that it's like, if you just start doing that with everything, it's like, then eventually the pattern that kind of like you get all of those different ideas for what you want to build from that starts to fragment. It starts to fall apart basically, and then you're entering into a situation where you're not on top anymore. You're basically you're uh, you're down. You go down to the level of your impulses. It's like I don't have a good necessarily way to. It's like exile basically. If you've ever read Mathieu's book, it's basically like you go down from being the on the top of the pyramid to being in exile, and you kind of wander around, and that's what the it kind of thing that happens in Atlantis is. So Atlantis is the city, it's like a technical place, and the people uh, eventually sink down under the water. So they go down into this place where now they're in exile. Now they're just moving fluidly around, under the sea, basically.
Mm.
So I think that's definitely like where a major for sure narrative that we're living in right now.
Do you have another more like positive or uplifting narrative that you also see sort of running through culture and society right now?
Well, the thing is, I don't actually think that the Atlantis narrative is totally negative. Like,
Hmm.
I don't think it's like because you know, if you do get into that situation, then the end result is the new world, basically. So, like Saint Christopher carries Christ across the river, and that's like when he carries Christ across the river, then that's when he basically becomes a saint. So it's like the like it's definitely gonna be a resurrection, because it's like that's obviously what the pattern of the resurrection is. It's like the going down into the grave and then like destroying it and then kind of coming back with all of the people and all of the so that's what's going to happen with the metaverse too, you know so and another thing that's nice is because it's like the way that the way that like that the narrative works with the water, the sinking into the water, let's say, is a uh, good way to understand how it is um, that your consciousness can reach a point where you have that experience shift. Like it was difficult at the beginning of the conversation when you asked me about that, but I think if you think about it like that, if you think about it as getting to a situation where it's you totally go down into the flood, then you kind of get an understanding of um, how the transformation can happen. Because like the flood is just is um is fluid, but like because it's fluid, it's also fluid to the fluid. This is not making sense, but it's like there's a Saint Paul, uh, verse in the Bible that he talks about um, uh, being a transgressor against his own law. So it's like if you transgress a transgression, then it's like not that doesn't like two wrongs can actually make a right in that situation. So you know,
So I'm guessing, sort of like, if I understand it correctly, sort of within the sort of sinking, let's say, of the metaverse or whatever is coming next, do you view also the planting of a seed
yes,
for
yeah, no,
like
that's perfect.
a
Yeah, that's a
revival
perfect way
or
to
a
put it.
renewal of? Okay.
Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. Yeah, no, that perfect. The perfect summary of what I was saying.
Yeah, so like I know we spoke about the metaverse online. We also spoke about I think it was the Crazy Mermaid story. Forgive me for forgetting
No,
the
no
name of the
problem.
saint,
Muragon.
Saint Muragon.
Yeah.
Do you mind, for people who don't know the story of Saint Muragon, telling the story and giving us sort of like your interpretation of it, because I think it links well to the metaverse, Atlantis. Um,
Yeah,
I
you're
think,
right. No, you're right. You're so right. You're really, that was a spot on. So yeah. So okay. So the story of Saint Muragon is that Saint Muragon is this. She's a princess. So she's the daughter of a king in Ireland, and it's a pagan king. And one day, the castle of the pagan king gets flooded. So everything gets flooded, and the only person that survives is her and her dog. And she prays to a pagan goddess to become a fish so that she can swim. And the pagan goddess grants that can become half a fish. So then she becomes a mermaid, and her dog becomes a seal. And they float in the ocean for 300 years, and then she gets caught in the net of um, of a monk who is on his way to establish a monastery in Ireland. And she tells the monk, she promises that she'll come back in a year to be baptized. And so a year later, after the monastery has been established, um, the monk is out at the ocean, and Saint Muragon comes back, and she gets baptized, and that's how she becomes a saint, basically. So I mean, you know, uh, as Frank said, I mean, this is definitely the pattern that we've been talking about, where it's like that the house gets flooded, the castle gets flooded, and actually she becomes a hybrid.
mm,
So the castle gets flooded, and she becomes a hybrid, and she goes down into the waters. And then it's like, while she's down there in the waters, then she gets caught the by the nets, and she basically gets uh she basically gets resurrected back up into, she gets resurrected, but she's by the monk through the fishing nets, which is like, you know, the the same pattern that we see in the Gospels. And you know, and that's how the story basically ends. So I mean, that is like I think that's a perfect summary of
yeah, I think
of
it's also really interesting that she prays to a pagan god, and that you know God still works through that to then bring about the resurrection, bring about the baptism, and bring about the miracle, which is
yeah.
also, as it ties to maybe darker aspects of the metaverse, can maybe give us hope into like just grate your teeth and maybe get through this. Maybe there's something cool on the other side. So
Yeah, for sure. I think, wow, I mean, um, but it's probably interesting too that it's probably interesting too that, like, why doesn't the pagan goddess just make her a whole fish? Like, that's also an interesting thing.
hmm,
It's like why wouldn't a whole fish be more of a, like, maybe there's something about the fact that she asks to be a whole fish, but she's asking a pagan goddess. I wonder if
it's
there's
true. I
something
guess
like,
half of that.
right, because it's a pagan goddess. So I don't know. That could be it. So,
Interesting.
yeah,
Well, staying in the same vein, but going back in time a little bit, oh, a lot bit, like another really impactful moment in, I guess, the history of Christianity, but also the history of the world, I believe, was the Reformation. So, can you speak sort of to what you view as the difference that the Reformation made in the way narratives are portrayed, and like in the way narratives sort of like play a role in people's lives?
yeah, sure. You mean the Protestant
Protestant
Reformation?
Reformation, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I think to probably understand the Protestant Reformation, you have to understand also the scholastic. Like, you have to understand, like, uh um so I think it actually goes back to Augustine. In
Okay.
Augustine, there's like a almost like a duality, and especially in the book like City of God. Um and he seems like he uses the word Reformation to refer to the action of the church in the world, as opposed to the word transformation. Um, and so in within Western Europe, at the very least, regardless of whether or not that was part of Augustine, the idea of Reformation as being the role that the church has is was something that was basically like very very thoroughly stamped in, basically like very thoroughly accepted, and you know uh, and that led to the uh, humanism, in the Renaissance, which was like, well, which was people wanting something different than a pessimistic outlook where you could only reform, but you couldn't completely transform. Because Reformation doesn't mean that you've got perfection. It just means that you're a little bit better than you were before,
Hmm.
which is good, but like it's not the best that you could have, right? And so I think so the humanist seems like they're wanting to, have something a little bit more positive than that, but obviously that desire wasn't properly formed, and so then you got a lot of the insanity with people, painting icons of the Virgin Mary, um, according to their female concubines or whatever it was, or the mistresses that they had that were actually other people's wives, and or you have Michelangelo just, I mean, basically, you know, throwing a giant pile of crap on like the entire tradition of drawing the creation of Adam, and so then eventually, then of course you have a reaction to that, but the reaction is now it's like it's also uh, it's just it's another Reformation. So it's like it's another it it's a Reformation that happens where now they're trying to curb the excesses, but
Hmm.
they cut too far, and then so the Protestants, they're iconoclasts basically, or like a lot of them are. Some of them are. It's hard to tell because like there's a lot of different Protestants, but in the Reformation, the Calvinists and the Puritans were all iconoclasts, and so they cut off too much. They cut off a lot of like the Catholics had this whole idea of the the nature as like there's like patterns in nature which kind of govern the world, and the Protestants um, got rid of that in the sense that they said that spirituality didn't depend at all on like the material conditions, and they also said that like so that gets tied into the fact that you have Protestant worship that doesn't have any worldly items in it, right? It doesn't have any icons, it doesn't have any
Hmm.
censors, because none of those things are needed. So I'm not saying that that's what I think. I'm just saying that's what that's what the idea was, and so uh but I mean, it's just excesses playing off each other, because it's like the whole reason why they thought that in the first place is because the way that the Catholics formulated the idea about nature having its own existence was in a way that was extremely dialectic and extremely limiting to. They didn't talk about it as like a mysterious um uh force that like existed in the depth of things. They talked about it in a very legalistic way. It's like, well,
Hmm.
you're a man, and that means that there's certain things, and you're a woman, and that means there's certain things, and or it's like that's just an example of but it would be like that for all things. It would be this very rigid uh conceptualization of like um the forms of things, and the rigidity caused people to be like, well, hang on, there's no room, like it's so rigid I can't do anything, and so they said, well, that must be problematic, and so it all must be idolatry, because you're saying that there's these you know forms, there's these natural patterns, but then what you're giving me is something that's like causing my spiritual life to be you know too limited. It's like so so anyway, so it's a very sad process. It's very it just it's a breakdown of it's just a breakdown in society, but it's just going back and forth from, one extreme like to another, and each progressive step is more, you know, towards the edge than the last one was. So,
Yeah. So
um,
like by constantly trying to, I guess, or I guess at the start you have this desire to maybe explicitate certain ideas, and then know that when you try to explicitate and dogmatize maybe certain ideas, you have other people that will run away with them and take them to maybe either logical conclusions that may or may not be sometimes too far, and
yeah,
that might be maybe an overreach, and then you have a response that's, I think we maybe see a response on the other side, which is I think we talked about like the woke stuff. You kind of
yeah, no, I agree. Well, and I mean, we're seeing the same, like it's the same two sides, like
yeah.
as that were there in the beginning, but they're now it's like now it's even more, they're even more disconnected from each other, because it's like on the one hand, like the like more conservative types are will say, well, this person is a man because of their genes,
Mm,
which are these tiny little cells. Like you don't even know they're there unless you have a microscope. It's like you never experienced them in your life. You've never felt a gene. So it's like so, but that's your manhood, right? Everything, your entire manhood comes from these genes. And then the other side is there's nothing. It's like there's not even it's so like, because you can't say that that's not being a man, this is being a man, because if you're doing that, you're excluding certain people who self-identify as a man. So then it's impossible to even say what being a man is. So those are the two extremes. It's like it's so rigidly defined that it means nothing, and then the other extreme is it's like so undefined that it means nothing. So it's just to these two. Yeah, so you're right, it's come to this point where it's like it's so extreme. Yeah, it's probably helping people to notice that there's a big problem.
yeah, for sure. And I guess like what I've sort of been thinking about, not necessarily in relationship to this question, but like when you have two extreme things like that. I guess in my context, I've been thinking about it more in terms of like in terms of medicine. So you have one side of medicine that's very analytical, like let's just look at data, numbers, blood tests, all of that. And this other side of medicine that's starting to emerge, that's a lot more narrative and sort of the patient's lived experience.
Mm,
And you can have situations in which you completely mistreat, in a sense, the patient
yeah,
by going in either one of those two directions. And so, how
yeah,
do you then reconcile those into something that like makes sense? And I think symbolism is the key to doing that. But I'm just, as I go through med school, I'm trying to figure that out. Like, how how
yeah.
how do you do this?
So, do you mean when you say the thing that's talking about just narrative, is that like the new age medicine?
It's not necessarily New Age medicine. It's more sort of this idea that how the person feels about their condition, or what they feel the best course of treatment is, like just sort
Hmm.
of empower the
Yeah,
person living with the condition to sort of make treatment decisions, sometimes when it goes too far at the expense of the medical expert's recommendation. So it's sort of like
yeah,
a excess of agency in a sense.
yeah. Right. No. Yeah. Yeah. You're sure. Yeah. Right. Okay. I see. Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Well, I've seen. For me. I've been noticing since I've been in the symbolic world. I've been noticing. I mean, I've been paying more attention to what we could call like spiritual remedies,
Hmm.
and like, uh, I would never, you know, I need to understand them, like, because there's some people who will give you insane spiritual remedies. They'll be like, well, this random root, will cure your headache. And it's like, well, I don't how that root means nothing to me. So unless it's some type of, like Motrin or something, it's like that can't be a spiritual healing.
Hmm.
So, but there are things where it's like, people will talk about uh, forgiveness heals your heart. It's like, okay, there you could see that there's an experience of um, wholeness in your center that you have when you're forgiven, and that is related to your physical health, in the sense that the discernment that you use to say that this is a good state of health and this is not a good state of health is how those things are measured in the first place. Because no one knows what the like actual ideal bone structure is. Like no one knows what, like that stuff comes from people saying this worked as a treatment and this didn't work as a treatment. And it's like that is the whole thing of why, you know, there's a double blind test in the first place to get rid of the placebo effect, which is that you know, that process is, you know, is a huge, you know, is that's the heart of the of health, you know, and of medicine. And there's certain, it's obviously not just that, because as people learn more medicine, then it's like you're not going to encounter someone who has a totally misaligned spine and who's healthy, because we've gone through so many people, we've, you know, gone through this process. It's like liturgical, you know, rites, you know, in the Orthodox Church. Like they've been developing for so many years, and there's so many layers on them. Like it's not going to be that you're going to find like a new one. But you also can't forget, like you can't forget that that's the place where, you know, that's the place where health comes from in the first place. Because otherwise you're going to be surprised, because that's going to be, you know, you're not going to be able to account for, because the models don't totally account for everything, you know. So there's going to be some strangeness in there that you're going to have to figure out how to deal with, and that's going to come from the, you know, from the discernment of people, you know. And that's related to the spiritual healing, because I think the spiritual healing, when you're really in tune with like the way that you experience the healing of forgiveness, let's say, then that will increase your ability to properly taste when something has healed you versus when something hasn't healed you. So it's like it's closer to that. So
Yeah, a lot of interesting thoughts there. I'll definitely think about prescribing forgiveness to my patients in the future.
well, the good idea. That's probably a good idea.
So as we begin to wrap up, I just want to talk to you about like a couple, you know, books slash sources slash inspirations. You know, what would you like reading in terms of symbolism? What's something that you read that's impacted you or influenced you or changed the way you think? And can you give us like a brief sort of description of why?
Yeah. The language of creation. Obviously, that was good. That was right.
Classic.
Yep. You got to read that one.
Yeah.
And then I think I mentioned last time that the Ethics of Beauty. That was a really good one.
And like for the Ethics of Beauty in particular, what exactly did you take like from that book?
It was I think it was the way that the author was able to kind of like it gradually affect. I think for people who, I think it's probably not useful necessarily for everyone, but for people who come from like a Protestant background where there's a very rigid kind of emphasis on like what the will of God is, then reading that book will be a way where your perception can be kind of gently realigned, and it's not the kind of realignment of that idea that would happen in with like, let's say, a bunch of woke students, you know, surrounding you and, you know, telling you you're a bigot or something, you know. So it's like so I think that that is for sure, you know, a major application of that book. That was how I think I used it for sure. That was what it was super. But let me see. I have a lot of books back here, so let me see.
Yeah, no, take your time.
No, I think those are probably the main ones. Those are probably the main ones I would definitely recommend. So yeah, so The Language of Creation and The Ethics of Beauty, and of course, obviously, like Lord of the Rings, and
Okay.
the C.S. Lewis, stories, and all of those. So yeah, those are those are the books.
All
Those are
right.
my recommendations.
Perfect. Well, Mike, it was a pleasure talking to you. I think that's a nice way to end it. We've been going for quite a while. So, like, do you have any sort of work published out there? Anything you want people to check out, maybe get to know?
I post regular stuff on the Symbolic World. I'm definitely active in that community.
Mm,
So hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to you guys on there, and and maybe in some, I don't know if there's ever going to be like a collab video on this thing, but that'd be cool. So yeah, so find me on the Symbolic World, and let's talk about something interesting and controversial. Well, actually, I don't know if you have any more time real quick, but I did want to say,
no, go ahead.
'cause we were talking about the way that the crazy stories kind of are useful, and the crazy stories are useful, I think, in the way where you don't see the the some of the Bible stories, like just the kind of canonical ones, at first appearance seem really simple, like they don't matter, like just because of how basic the information is. But if you can see kind of how if you can see how the crazy story comes from the basic story, I think we kind of did that earlier when we were talking about the Murgon story.
Mm,
You set
yeah,
that up really nicely. Then it ends up then the crazy story ends up being a support for the biblical story. It ends up being an emphasis of it.
yeah.
So those are really important. So okay, anyway, yeah. So thank you very much.
No problem. People go read crazy stories. There's very interesting things out there that are waiting to be discovered. So, on that note, well, bye, everybody.
See ya.